Okay, good morning. We are on Memhei Amud Aleph 45a. So I got a little ahead of myself yesterday because something I shared with you yesterday is going to be parsed out and defined today, specifically as follows. We have three different laws that must be derived from the verses describing the law of Shikcha, the law of forgetting a sheaf. So let's first start with the let's go with the sages first, because they have three inclusions. Inclusion number one is she's buried in the field, right? That was the sage's view.
The conclusion.
No, sorry. The sage's, yeah, the sage's even something buried in the field, even if it's buried from the second in the field, from that word. Derivation number two is even stalks that are still attached to the ground from the first in field. And then the third is when a sheaf flew over from a neighbor. That's to be excluded from the law because it says your field, because of the your, right? That was the sages. It's to be excluded from the law. Clear on that, yeah? That was the sages. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says buried in the field is excluded by the word bisada in your field. Because bisada, the bays, means on the field. And if we're not in the field, excluded that. And then we include stalks because it says the second in your field. And the fact that it flies over, no, the fact that it flies over is excluded by, no, sorry. The fact that we exclude in the field, we exclude buried because the verse says harvest, and harvest is only above ground, not in the ground. We include in the with the word in the field, we include crops because it's also on the field, and we include the flying over, or we exclude the flying over by the first in your field. And the difference between your and not your is immaterial to Rabbi Yehuda.
But then Rabbi Yehuda said that the second in your field is for
stalks. That's right. And the first in your field is for flying over, but the your is inconsequential. And we exclude that which is buried because it says harvest, and harvest is only above ground. Contextually, it's got to be in harvest. Okay, so here's where I got ahead of myself. I got ahead of myself because I described this law of the sheaf that flew over. I described it as floating in that it remains floating even as it's in the new field, on top of something else or on a stick, right? That's how I described it. That's right. So that's where I got ahead of myself. Because what the Gemara is going to do today is going to discuss, well, how do you define that floating? Is floating a description of how it arrived here? Or is floating a description of how it is present here, that it's still floating? That's the Gemara is going to discuss today. And why is that relevant? So, well, if the issue is that it's presently here floating,
could be his.
Then even my own.
Not
someone else's. Even my own crops, my own sheaves that are piled on top of other sheaves are floating, and if they're not part of the forgotten law, and I can go back and pick it up. So I got ahead of myself in describing it as retaining its floating status, but the Gemara is going to discuss that now. Okay, so let's see. Okay, it's the third to last word in the line. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah. So the line ends at the word Yirmiyah. So if you count down from the wide set of lines, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The last word is Yirmiyah, and 3 words before is Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Yeah. The third to last word is Boy. Okay. So you'll remember the way in which the Gemara introduces a question tells us the kind of question. Specifically, here the Gemara introduces the question with the word Boy. That's the
For just informational purposes.
That's correct. So the best way to translate that, it would be is an inquiry in which the questioner has no objective, no opinion, just wants to know. So boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah posed the following inquiry. Safu oimrin l'toich sadeu. There are sheaves floating within his field, irrespective of where it came from. They're floating in his field. It's on a rock. It's on a stick. It's floating in the air. It's not on the ground. Mahu, what is the law? Is that still part of the forgotten sheaves and therefore forbidden to go back and collect? And what's the two sides to the coin? Do I say Avir Sotah, the airspace of the field, because Sotah has the same law as the field itself, and thus it's part of the forgotten law, and therefore I cannot go back and collect it. Dami is to be compared. Compare the airspace to the actual field. Oh, Lafke Sotah Dami. Or is the airspace not to be compared to the actual field? Right? Torah says when you lose it and you forget it in your field, is the airspace part of the field? So this is his question. This is the inquiry he poses. It's not on the ground of my field. It's in the airspace of my field. Is the law of Shikcha apply? Am I allowed to go back and collect that or not? So the Gemara is going to try to resolve that by introducing what we learned yesterday, where it says floating. There it says floating from your friend. What's the point of that statement? Is the point of your statement that it came from your friend, or is the point of the statement that it's floating? What's the point of that statement? What are you emphasizing? And if we're going to emphasize the fact that it's floating, then what's the difference if it came from my friend or not? It's floating. If we're emphasizing your friend, well, then that's the difference, because there it came from my friend. And therefore, even if it's on the ground, it's still excluded because it came from my friend, right? And if the emphasis is on friend, why say the word safu? Why say floating? Yesterday's statement from Rabbi stated clearly it's floating. Why use that word floating if the emphasis is from your friend? So this is the Gemara's going to be discussion today. Sorry?
There are 2 words involved here. The one is, I don't know them in Hebrew, but
yeah,
your and floating.
So I'll translate the words as best I can. Okay, it wasn't
your.
It wasn't Rabbi Yehuda. It was the Gemara suggesting that Rabbi Yehuda is deriving the same thing that Rabbi Bohu said in Rabbi Lezer. So that's the statement in question. The Gemara linked it to, but the statement that Rabbi Bohu said in Rabbi Lezer is like this: excluding floating sheaves into the field of his friend. That's all he says. We're excluding from the law of the forgotten sheaves, floating sheaves into the field of his friend. So is the point floating, or is the point that it came from his friend? That's the Gemara is going to discuss at the moment. Yeah, we're clear? Robert, you there?
Yeah, I just was thinking into his friend. Which way is it going? Is it going from his field to the neighbor, or is it? I don't think it matters. But
What's the difference? The question is who's the one that we're who's the one that's prohibited from going back and getting it? Well, I'm not allowed to go into my neighbor's field without his permission anyway. The question is if I'm allowed to take it.
Right.
Well, actually, no. Maybe it'll come up because the Gemara is going to discuss. It's a good point because the Gemara doesn't discuss it directly, not that I know of, but maybe it'll come up because the Gemara is going to discuss whether you acquired it or not, and at what point did you acquire that, like legally? When did it become belonging to you? So let's see. So Amr Rav Kana Rav Papi. Rav Kana told Rav Papi. For Amrullah, others say it was Rav Kana Rav Zvid, Rav Kana speaking to Rav Zvid. So what's interesting here is that the person who posed the inquiry is not being spoken to. Rabbi Yirmiyah posed the inquiry. Mm-hmm. And the Gemara tells us that Rav Kana told Rav Papi, or Rav Kana told Rav Zvid, which means, perhaps, as we learned a number of times, the Gemara is a conglomerate of conversations that have taken place over centuries, actually. So it's quite possible that Rabbi Yirmiyah poses the question at one point in time. It's a good question. No one has a resolution, so it gets included in the Gemara as a good question. Sometime later, Rav Kana and Rav Papi, or Rav Kana and Rav Zvid, are discussing this inquiry that was posed earlier, and then they say, well, hey, maybe this is a solution. So because that solution is a possibility, and there's an interesting conversation, the Gemara includes that also. But it looks like just one consecutive narrative, when really, if you look at the names, the person posing the question is not the person who's part of the solution. Right? Rav Yirmiyah poses the question, and then Rav Kana tells Rav Zvid, or Rav Kana tells Rav Papi, depending on which version. So what did Rav Kana say? He said, Tishitlei, let us resolve this inquiry from Rav Yirmiyah, this inquiry that was obviously said sometime earlier. Let's resolve that midrababo Rabbi Lezer, from the statement of Rabbi Bo in the name of Rabbi Lezer, which we learned about yesterday. The Omar, which Rabbi Bo he said in the name of Rabbi Lezer, Prat l'shetzofru oimen l'toich sedei chaveroi. We exclude from the law of aloft sheaves, floating sheaves into the field of his friend. How we can derive it from there? The chaveroi in, we exclude that which comes from your friend, but if it floated into his own field, it's not excluded. Emphasis on the friend part. Right? That's what Rav Kana suggests. The point of the law of Rabbi Bobo is that it came from this person's field to another person's field. Especially as the Gemara learned it yesterday from the sages, your field, Sotah, your field. Right? The point here being that it came from someone else's field, not from my own. And if it came from my own, it's still part of the law of Shikcha. And therefore, I can't go back and collect it. Only when it came from my friends, then I'm allowed to collect it. Yeah.
What do you do with it if it's your friends and you don't collect it? You give it back to them?
If it's your friend and you collect it, well, let's assume let's assume that it's a side issue, but let's assume that the original owner gave up hope on ever getting it back.
Right. Then you can allow it.
And let's say I own it now. Let's just assume that I own it. Yeah.
The more important issue is that
whether it's part of the Shikcha or not. Yeah.
It's not part of the law.
A Shikcha. Yeah. It's not part of the prohibition of lo yisashuvu. It's not part of the prohibition of you may not go back and collect it, which means it's double negative. Therefore, you may go back and collect it. Right. So the sort of Kahana suggests emphasis on friend, and therefore, if it floated into my own field, it's part of the law of Shikcha, and I may not collect it. Yeah. So the Gemara counters, or perhaps it's Rav Zvid or Rav Papi, whoever he's speaking to, counter and say, well, ulutamech, following your logic, if we're going to emphasize the wording of Rav Abahu, why are you only emphasizing friend? When it comes into the field of his friend, Safu, he said that it's floating. That's when it's to be excluded. But munachin, but if it lands actually on the ground, loy, it's not to be excluded. And if I'm not allowed to go collect the other person's field stuff that landed on my yard, on my field. If you're going to emphasize the wording of Rabbi Bohu, I'm going to try to resolve the issue from there and say, well, if it comes to my friend, then it's excluded, as Rabbi Bohu said. But if it came from my field, it's not to be excluded. But Rabbi Bohu also said safu floating, which means if it's floating in the airspace of my field from my friend, then it's to be excluded. What if it lands on the actual ground of my field from my friend? Then it's not excluded, and I may not go back and get it. Now that can't be the case because we have to satisfy the verse which says your field, Valeka, and this is not there anymore because it's in the other guy's field. Maybe that's the point. It's talking about the other person. See Rashi? Yeah.
No, it's going the other way.
It's going the other way. You're right. It's going from me to my, That's right. It's going from me to my friends. And the question is, am I letting it go collect it or not? I forgot it at my friend's field because it flew there. Right. So if it landed in my friend, so it floats into my other friend's field, that's excluded. Rabbi Kana suggested the issue here is friend. So it's not in my field, my friend's field, and there's why I'm not, that's why it's not part of the Shikcha and I'm allowed to go collect it. Well, if you're going to emphasize the wording, he also uses the word floating. So which means only if it landed on the rock of my friend's field. What if it landed on my friend's field itself? It's still not my field. So what's the point? All right. So therefore, therefore we must say, rather, if it flew into my friend's field, even if it lands on the actual ground of my friend's field, it's still excluded because it's got to be your field, not someone else's field. And therefore I may go collect it because it's excluded from the law of Shikcha. That's
your field.
That's right. So why did Rabbi emphasize that it floated? Why floating? Why is he using that word? Because it's impossible to get to the other guy's field, unless it floats. In other words, we must conclude that the word floating is not a description of where it is, but how it got there. Because once I'm in my friend's field, it makes a difference where it is, whether it's on the ground or in the air. The point is it's in my friend's field. So why say floating? It's a description of how it got there, not where it landed. Now, if that's the case, what if it's floating in my own field? I have no resolution yet. I cannot resolve it from Rabbi Bohu's statement. Because Rabbi Bohu, who excludes the floating sheaf, is not because it's floating, but because it's in my friend's field, irrespective of whether it's landed floating there or landed on the ground there. The word floating is only to describe how it got there, not where it is. Because it's in my friend's field, it's not part of the law of Shikcha. What if it's in my field, but... Sorry?
Floating means somebody transferred it or the wind?
The wind blew it. It's a description of how it got there. Otherwise, someone stole. Right? So the description that Rabbi Bohu gives of floating into my friend's field is not to describe where it is, but it's only a description of how it got there. Because irrespective of where it is in my friend's field, whether it's in the airspace of my friend's field or on the ground of my friend's field, it's excluded because it's not in my field.
Mm-hmm.
Which means if it's floating in my field, I still have no resolution yet because I don't know if floating is an issue. Rabbi Bohu doesn't help me there because all Rabbi Bohu said, the issue is your field versus not your field. As for the word floating in his statement, that's just a description of how it got there. So we're back to square one of Rabbi Yirmiyah's question. When the sheaf is floating in my own field, is that airspace considered part of the ground and therefore it's part of the law of Shikcha, I may not collect it? Or is the airspace not part of the ground and therefore I may go collect it because it's not part of the law of Shikcha? This is the Gemara's question. The inquiry still remains. Okay. Now the Gemara suggests another possible solution. And this is going to touch a little bit on your point about whether you own it or not. Right? But even though as it's clear now that the issue is not my friend being able to collect it, but about me being able to collect it when it's someone else's field, or is it considered shikha or not? Right? That's the point. Can I go knock on his door and say, hey, she floated in there, give back to me? Or is it part of the prohibition? I may not go back.
Mm-hmm.
To which the Rabbi Bowie says, you may go collect it because it's not in your field, and the Torah says your field.
And
whether it landed in the airspace or landed on the ground is irrelevant.
When you may collect it, then it means that it's not subject to shikha.
It's not subject to the laws of shikha. It's not in my field, irrespective of whether it's on the ground or in the airspace.
Even if it was yours and it floated.
That's correct. Correct. So we're back to square one. If it's floating in my own yard, my own field, is that considered, is the airspace excluded from the ground and therefore I'm allowed to collect it? Or is the airspace part of the ground and therefore I'm not allowed to collect it because it's still under the law of shikha?
So floating in your own area, we have to define what that is. Does
So
it mean
I'm
floated and then it landed on something,
Correct.
or floated and it landed to the ground?
No, landed on, well, if it landed on the ground, then it's on my field.
Then
It's,
on-
I'm cutting and some piece that I forgot floats and lands on top of another pile. So I never touched the ground, or it landed on a rock, I never touched the ground. So I forgot it, but it didn't land on the ground. So is that airspace still part of the law of Shikcha, or is the airspace not part of the law of Shikcha?
We're still back there.
We're back at square one. So the Gemara suggests another possible solution. Tashma, come and listen. The narrator of the Gemara itself seems to suggest this conclusion. The Gemara doesn't have any author to the one suggesting this conclusion. So this could be sometime even later. Another proposition to the same inquiry that's been going for decades already now. Or maybe, I don't know what the age gap between Rav Yirmiyah and Rav Kana is, because those are the two people spoken about earlier, but this could be even later. I don't know. Okay, Tashmas, the Gemara suggests a possible another solution. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines up from the bottom, and the first words in the line. Tashma, come and listen. Listen to the following text, and let's see if we can deduce from there a possible resolution to Rabbi Bo's inquiry. So the text reads as follows. Oimer, a sheaf, shehichzik boy, that the person already held onto. So he didn't forget it in his collection. He actually held onto it at one point. And his intention was to take it to the city to sell or whatever, to his storehouse, wherever. He's taking it out of his field. Now, and after he already collected it, he put it down on top of another sheaf. So it's not on the ground. And now he forgot both of them. So there's 2 forgotten sheaves. One's in the bottom, on the ground, and the other one is on top, not on the ground. So the text reads like this. A dispute. First opinion. Hatachton, the one below, Shikcha, is part of the law of Shikcha. I may not go collect it. Va'elyon, the one on top, Ene Shikcha, is not part of the law of forgetting, and I may go collect it. Why? Well, why? The one on the ground is Shikcha, because what? Because why shouldn't it be? I forgot it on the ground. The one on top, it's not on the ground, it's on the other sheaf.
The floating one.
It's the floating one. Presumably, this indicates that when it's floating, it's not part of the law of Shikcha. At least according to this
floating here is defined as not
touching the ground. It's in the airspace. It's being held up by another sheaf. So that's seemingly that's why the Gemara is introducing this text as a proof.
Mm-hmm.
But the text continues. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, the text introduces a second opinion. Rabbi Shimon, son of Yehuda, says, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, presumably the Rabbi Shimon here is not himself, right? Rabbi Shimon, son of Yehuda, speaking in the name of Rabbi Shimon, and usually when the Mishnah tells us Rabbi Shimon without telling us any suffix to his name, it's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda speaking in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Shneim, both of them, the one on the bottom and on the top, Einon Shikcha, are not part of the law of Shikcha, and you may go collect them. Now, the top one, we know the reason why, because it's the floating one. Why the bottom one? So explains Rabbi Shimon. Hatacht in the lower one, mipnei shu tamin, because it is concealed underground. It's not underground, it's under another sheaf. But if it's concealed, it's not part of the law of forgotten. At least according to Rabbi Apud, according to that opinion. Va'elyon, and the one on top, mipnei shu tzaf, because it's floating. End quote from that text. So what can we conclude? Ad kan lai pligi, the dispute between these two views are only in regard to Ella betachten, but the lower one. According to the opening sage, the fact that it's concealed is immaterial. That's still part of the law of Shikcha. And according to Rabbi Shimon, because it's concealed, it's not part of the law of Shikcha. But as for the top one, divrei hakol loy have Shikcha. Everybody agrees the top one is not part of the law of Shikcha. Why? As Rabbi Shimon put it, because it's floating. So thus we should be able to conclude from here that a floating sheaf, even my own field, is not part of Shikcha. Because airspace is not to be included in the field that is required to leave behind forgotten things. And thus I may go back and collect it because it's floating. This is the Gemara's suggested conclusion at the moment. Gemara says, no, we cannot conclude from here conclusively that all floating sheaves are not part of the law of Shikcha. Why is that? Shiny Hasam, that instance is different. Why? Kivin the Ichzer Bey. The Gemara describes a situation, the Mishnah describes a situation like this. The person held on to it to take it to the city and then put it down and then forgot it. Says the Mishnah, says the Gemara, the reason why that top one is not part of Shikcha is not because it's floating, but because he grabbed it already once. And Kivin the Zacha Bey, once he acquired it, he already took it. The forgetting is when you forget from the beginning. He didn't forget from the beginning. He actually owned it. And then he forgot it. No? What's the problem with this statement?
Well, when you bind sheaves,
Yeah.
you have the intent that you're not binding it to leave it there. You're binding it because you have an intent.
That's why the Mishnah adds, he took it to take it to the city. He didn't just bind it to be left on the spot, which is usually what happens, but he actually picked it up to start walking out.
Okay, so there's a difference.
And there's the point. So the Gemara asks, hold on a second. If the reason why it's not part of Shikcha is because you were started to walk to the city, why does it matter that he placed it on top of another sheaf? Even if you put it down on the actual ground, it would be the same law because you already started taking it out.
Then that's the problem with the other sheaves.
Right. So the Gemara says, you're right. Actually, that's true. This, if you picked it up to walk out, even if you put it on the ground, it's not part of the Shikcha. So then why emphasize that you place it down on top of another one? Mishum tachten. Because he wants to teach us another law that the one below, there's a dispute whether it's considered concealed or not. But for it itself,
concealment, not for floating.
That's right. The one on top, the reason why everybody agrees it's not part of Shikcha is because you're about to walk out with it. And the reason why, and the fact that he put it down and floating is immaterial. The point is he wanted to walk out. So why describe it in such a strange situation? We put it down on top of another one? Well, because we want to teach you another law, that there's a dispute whether the one under it is considered concealed or not. Or whether the fact that it's concealed is exempts it from Shikcha or not. The Gemara has a very simple problem though. But Rabbi Shimon said clearly in his statement, he said, the reason why the top one is not part of Shikcha is because it's floating. So you're giving all kinds of other explanations, but what explanation did he give? You're telling me the reason why it's not part of Shikcha is because he started carrying it out. Is that what Rabbi Shimon said? No, Rabbi Shimon said the reason why it's not included is because it was floating.
Two competing reasons for that.
Right. So if the Mishnah gave no reason and you had two competing reasons, then you can chalk it up to one and say the other one's unresolved. But Rabbi Shimon himself gives the reason. He says the reason why the top one is not considered part of Shikcha is because it's floating, which seems to be clearly stating that floating sheaves are not part of the law. Says the Gemara, Ema, you might read Mipnei Shehu Kitsof. Not that it's not that Rabbi Shimon is saying that because it is floating, therefore it's excluded. But rather you could say it's as if it's floating, meaning it's as if I never put it down because I picked it up. Not that the floating is the issue. The issue is that I picked it up to walk out. As for the fact that Rabbi Shimon used the word because it's floating, what he meant was it's as if it's floating, meaning it's as if I never put it down because I was about to walk out with it. And therefore, we still remain unresolved. If my own sheaves are floating in my own field, is a part of the law of Shikcha or not? Remain unresolved.
It's not unresolved to the issue of concealed.
That's a dispute.
That's also a dispute.
That remains a dispute. Whether, right, that goes back to the first dispute.
That statement, though, conclude that in the law of Shikcha that concealed items are not.
No, the Mishnah gave two opinions, right? Which is consistent with the two opinions we had away at the beginning, whether we exclude buried or not.
For sure, absolutely,
right?
yeah.
That's consistent with those two opinions. The question is,
This is just
for the higher
in
one,
support of
that's right.
gentleman.
For the higher one, which Rabbi Shimon says the reason why the higher one's excluded from Shikcha is because it's floating. Did he mean literally because it's floating and that's the exclusion? To which the Gemara suggests not necessarily, because if that were the case, the Mishnah would have never described it as he took it to walk out of the city. Why say that? Just say one sheaf on top of another. The top one is floating, not included. The bottom one, dispute. Why describe it as you picked it up to walk to the city? Because it's relevant to the law. And only when you're picking it up to walk to the city, that's when it's excluded from Shikcha. As for your description of floating, you don't mean the floating is the issue. You mean that it's still not put down, even though you actually put it down. But legally, you didn't put it down because you're about to walk out. And that's what it means when he says floating.
That's what he meant by floating.
That's correct. Not because it's the floating.
He took possession of it and he.
That's right. And halachically, you never put it down yet, even though you technically put it down. Because halachically, you took it out to walk out. Because otherwise, why just open the whole scenario as you took it to walk out? Just say one sheaf on top of another, top one floating, bottom one concealed. And the fact that the Mishnah introduces it as I was walking with it to go to the city means that that's what defines the law here. And the wording of floating is only to describe the halachic status of it. The halachic status is that it's still not on the ground. It's as if you're still holding it, even though you technically put it down.
But it was there to teach something else
about the one below, which is the dispute.
Yeah.
So it has two laws, this Mishnah. Number one, that once you acquire it to leave, it's out of the law of Shikcha. Everybody agrees. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is to tell you a dispute. When a sheaf is concealed under another, is it part of Shikcha or not? It's the two laws that this text tells us. But none of them have any bearing on our question whether a floating sheaf is part of the law or not. Okay, so this is the Gemara, and the Gemara believes it unresolved somewhat, but the Gemara is going to get into more details about floating and concealed. Some more details coming, God willing, tomorrow. A wonderful day, Eden.